Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Logic Without Math. Analogies are around us everywhere, so it is useful to know about them. In the following, I will discuss what they are, what uses they have, and how to know a good analogy from a bad one. They have instructive and literary purposes, as well as a use for persuasion in arguments. I will start with analogies made for purposes of persuasion, but much of what I say applies across the board. It happens often in our daily lives that arguments are made or even thought up by ourselves that a proposition about a particular thing may be true due to it being similar to another thing. A new novel is published by your favorite author whose books you enjoyed in the past. So you buy it rather than that other book from someone you've never read. The idea is that this new book shares an attribute with other books you enjoyed of having been written by the same person. Likewise, when I see a video here that I like, I check out other videos on that channel. Another example would be the reason why many people suggest there is probably life on other planets somewhere. They will argue that our own sun is in fact a typical star, and that we have every reason to believe that another Earth-like planet may be orbiting some of them. I remember seeing it on the news many years ago that a team of astronomers had identified a star with something of similar size than Earth orbiting it from a similar distance. These are arguments by analogy, where the appeal is that one thing has attributes in common with other things, and what is true of those things may also be true of the thing under consideration. This, however, is only a probable inference of inductive logic, rather than deductive logic that grants us certainty. The only time we can claim deductive certainty is when the things compared have all attributes in common, such that they are effectively instances of the same thing, and then any proposition that is true of one will be true of the other. And that kind of argument would not even be an analogy, really. For additional clarification, when I talk about things or entities for convenience, I am speaking of what may also apply to situations, events, relations, or something else. The form this argument takes is that the first premise establishes that any number of things, let's say 3 things, A, B, and C, have a series of attributes. And let's say there are 3 of these attributes, P, Q, and R. The second premise is that 2 things, A and B, have a 4th attribute, S. Now, can you feel the conclusion coming? Of course, the thing under consideration, C, probably also has that 4th attribute, S. However, it is quite rare in writing or in speech that an argument from analogy will be explicitly stated in this structure, so that the first step in evaluating an analogy will be to translate it into a structure. I will use an example from Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion from 2006, who was criticized for writing a book denying the existence of God without first being a theologian. He is quoted as having responded that, quote, "Most of us happily disavow fairies, astrology, and the flying spaghetti monster without first immersing ourselves in books of Pastafarian theology," unquote. Dawkins is talking about 4 items here: fairies, God, astrology, and the flying spaghetti monster. It is obvious he starts by attaching to all 3, in addition to God, the property of them being subject of a theology. The rest needs some interpretation. He says literally that most of us happily disavow the 3 items other than God, and for our purposes here, I will take him to mean that it is reasonable to disavow them without studying their theologies. The rest of the argument is left unstated, presumably because Dawkins considers it obvious. God also shares the attribute of being the subject of a theology, and therefore God has that other attribute that it is reasonable for Dawkins to disavow God without first immersing himself in that theology. If his analogy is accepted, The implication is that his critics committed the fallacy of Courtier's reply, where they claimed he needed some expertise that he really did not need. And this is explained in another video that I've done. In many instances, analogies are created for purposes of explanation or even imagery rather than to convince us of the truth of some proposition. Especially for explanation, analogies can be useful to get people to think about something in a particular way. Let's say, for example, that I am your psychology professor, and I am teaching about introversion and extroversion, which in reality is a distinction between drawing psychic energy from within and drawing psychic energy from without. I then go through the behaviors associated with them, such as extroverts having a radio or TV going on in the background. In that case, I would want you to think of the distinction as a continuum and get out of your mind any pretension that people are all one and nothing of the other, or that there is anything that either group always or never does. I would also want to deprive extroverts of their pretensions to moral superiority. So I might draw an analogy by saying it is like being left or right-handed. Some people do everything in a left-handed way or do everything in a right-handed way so that they don't get clumsy. But there are switch hitters in baseball. And in hockey, most players shoot left, even though you'll see them signing autographs with the right hand. Still, there is one way that feels more comfortable. In terms of imagery, Plato's allegory of the cave in the Republic is effectively an analogy separate from his argument and meant to illustrate it. It likens our sense experience of particular things, not showing us their eternal and unchanging essences, to seeing shadows of puppets projected on a wall of a theater that we cannot escape, rather than watching the real puppet show outside. In literature, novels especially can have a theme that renders metaphors an attempt to persuade as well as an attempt to entertain. The upshot of this is that not every analogy is even a part of an argument, but a possibility of it is there in all kinds of writing or speech. Nevertheless, whether it is used in literature, in the classroom, or in an argument for purposes of persuasion, you can use the same advice I will give to evaluate how good that metaphor is if you want to. It may also be useful to point out that even if a bad analogy is given as evidence along with another argument, the validity of that other argument may still establish the conclusion. In terms of evaluating analogies, this is where I think we have more of an art than a science. They are not all equally good or bad, with no definitive quantitative measurement. A bad analogy is not really a fallacy, because it may still lend some support for a conclusion, even if only minimal. And nevertheless, there are some good guidelines to follow, in addition to translating them into a structural form. And these guidelines can allow us to more objectively debate the reasonableness of accepting an analogy as evidence. The first and most important criterion is the issue of the relevance of any resemblances or the attributes. If the analogy is entirely irrelevant and on that basis cannot support the conclusion, then it becomes a red herring fallacy, which I explained in my Fallacies of Abuse video. Let's say the guy next door bought a new car last month, and he tells you he gets great mileage. So you want to buy a car like that. So, would you then look for a car of the same color, with similar seats and a similar sound system? Those are irrelevant resemblances because they have nothing to do with mileage. It may be better to get the same make and model, or a competitor's version of that car, or something of similar weight and motor size, because those resemblances will be relevant. Likewise, if you buy and try reading a boring book, you don't decide to stop buying books at that bookstore. The second criterion I will give is that we should consider the strength of the conclusion in relation to the premises. Is the conclusion too strong to be probable? For instance, if you buy a car that is of similar weight and motor size, and you anticipate on that basis getting exactly the same mileage as the guy next door, the conclusion is too strong. The greater variation you allow in your prediction, the more modest it is, the more likely it is to be true. The third criterion consists in the number of entities that possess the shared attributes. This is consistent with the general idea of induction, that the conclusion becomes more probable with a greater number of instances under consideration. If I recommend a restaurant to you, but I tell you I only went there once, my recommendation would not result in a high probability that you will find their food satisfactory. If I ate there 10 times, it would make it more probable. However, it would not make it 10 times more likely that you would enjoy that food there, because this is not subject to a set formula. A fourth criterion I will propose is the number of respects in which the things involved are said to be analogous. The more attributes all the things have in common, including the thing in the conclusion, the greater the probability of the conclusion. If you buy a suit at a store and you're satisfied with it, you may want to buy another one at the same store. It is more likely that you will be satisfied with the second suit if it is priced as high, from the same manufacturer, and worn under similar conditions. The greater the number of shared attributes, the more likely the conclusion. As a fifth criterion, we look to the presence of any dissimilarities that may be relevant between the object in the conclusion and the other objects in the argument. The more dissimilar the subject of the conclusion is from those other things, the less probable will be that conclusion. For instance, many mammals have fur all over their bodies. This applies to felines, canines, and rodents. Humans are also mammals, but before concluding that we would also have fur, we could consider that we have many dissimilarities with those others mentioned. We are primates walking on two legs with no tail and a different skull shape, unlike those others, the felines, canines, and rodents. As for a sixth criterion, it will also involve looking at differences, but this time in the other direction. I refer now to the structure of the second premise in the form of the argument, which does not contain the entity that is in the conclusion, and does contain the same attribute in the conclusion. The greater the number of dissimilarities existing in those items, the stronger the argument. An attribute distributed among dissimilar things in the second premise points to a larger number of other factors being inoperative. For example, let's say you just graduated from your high school with an 80% average in your last year. 20 students who did the same before you went to a university and successfully achieved a bachelor's degree. Does this mean that your high school adequately prepared you and that you will be likely to also succeed? This is more likely to be true if the previous 20 students are of different races, religions, economic classes, family situations. Then an assumption that those kinds of attributes need not be shared by you applies, indicating that the high school more probably does adequately prepare its students. And so the better analogy is the one having more dissimilarities among the entities other than the one in the conclusion. So in summary, a good analogy is one that makes relevant comparisons, draws a conclusion that is modest enough to fit the premises, has a high number of entities and a high number of shared attributes, minimizes dissimilarities between the entity in the conclusion and the others, but maximizes the dissimilarities between the entities not in the conclusion. A bad analogy is one that does any of making irrelevant comparisons, drawing too strong a conclusion, citing a low number of entities or shared attributes, having dissimilarities between the entity in the conclusion and the others, and having few or no dissimilarities among the entities not in the conclusion. So if you enjoyed this presentation, well, guess what? It means you probably will like some of my other videos, and maybe you'd like to share them with your friends. And with that in mind, thanks for watching.